Covering 70% of our planet, water is the most important resource that we have. Because of it, this is the only planet that we know of to harbor life. And we are the stewards, the guardians of this important resource. There's historically been a deep appreciation of this role in the Gulf region. We have been negotiating and compromising with nature for centuries. The earliest examples of nature-based solutions can be found in the intricately designed Islamic gardens, where water was a central feature. The design of ancient irrigation canals, developed in the Arabian Peninsula and Persia, were innovative and game-changing, and they're still being used today. They spread quickly around the world as far west as South America. But today, the region is facing a lot of new challenges. The Gulf is particularly sensitive to the challenges posed by water security in the face of a changing climate. 6 of the 10 most water-stressed countries are in the region. Facing this challenge requires an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach, one that connects cutting-edge science, technology, and innovation with policy, governance, and politics. And that's why we're here today. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, honored guests, I'm very happy to welcome you to the Sustaining the Oasis Conference, co-organized by Georgetown University in Qatar and Georgetown University's Earth Commons Institute. This is a first-of-its-kind collaborative effort across the university, and it is to highlight our new and emerging environment programs to complement our existing well-established programs in international affairs and policy. Our agenda today features speakers from 35 different organizations coming from across the region and the globe. I'm truly so proud of everyone that we have gathered here today, the esteemed experts. And especially given that there are so many other priorities going on right now, especially in this region, I truly thank you for taking the time to be here. Over the next 2 days, we will strive to discuss water's fundamental role as a source for cooperation and a driver for the economy in this region. We want this conference to serve as a platform for discussion and collaboration on water security, and truly hope that it will serve as a unique platform for environmental dialogue going into the future. And I'm very happy and very proud to share that among the other planned outcomes, the high-level findings from this conference will be shared with the COP28 presidency team to inform discussions and negotiations around water. And with that, I would like to introduce Dean Pete Marra, who is the Dean of Georgetown University's Earth Commons Institute, to say a few welcome remarks and get us started. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raha. Thank you very much for all you've done. Raha has been sort of the mastermind behind pulling a lot of this together over the last several months. Pulling these things, sorts of things together are not easy to do, and she was also supported by an incredible staff at Georgetown University, Qatar as well. So this is a massive undertaking if you didn't know that already. So a round of applause for Raha and the team at Georgetown University, Qatar. So a few months ago, I woke up to a text from a friend and lived in Ottawa, and he was telling me that he was flying to British Columbia, which is in Western Canada, because his mother's house was in the fire zone of a raging, rapidly moving fire in Western Canada. And he was going to be packing up his mother's things and moving her to a different part of, probably to Vancouver or somewhere else. But it occurred to me as I was reading this email that a close friend of mine was becoming a climate refugee. And unfortunately, this is not an unusual story that we're hearing from around the world. This is not unique to the Western United States at all, California or Vancouver, or most recently in Hawaii. This also occurs in Greece, in Australia, in a variety of places. This is unfortunately a very sad reality of what we're now dealing with. But when I got in my car and I turned on NPR, there was a story that came on around an experimental sail that was being put on a commercial ship that was going from China to Panama. And it was actually, they called it a fin, not really a sail, but that's essentially what it was. And it was going to be capturing wind power and sailing across the sea to Panama, saving 20 tons of CO2 emission that was going to be going into the atmosphere. And I couldn't help but think about, the choice that I had that morning. I could either sort of focus on the negative issues associated with my friend and his mother becoming climate refugees, or I could sort of think about the positive power that we see through solutions and what we can actually do as people on this planet to move us forward in positive and really important ways. And I think it also captures what we're trying to do at Georgetown University through the new creation of something called the Earth Commons, by creating environmental education, transformative educational opportunities, research opportunities, and action on the ground all around environmental issues. I started my career at the Smithsonian, where I spent 20 years studying birds. And I moved to Georgetown because I was really excited about the transformative power of education, about events like this, about environmental degrees, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, convergent degrees around environmental education and the power that that actually does, by bringing on scholars and researchers that use their research programs as experiential opportunities to teach people about the power of knowledge and knowledge acquisition. And that's what we're doing in the Earth Commons at every level, through courses, research programs, degrees, but also informally in venues like this, where we're bringing people together, two campuses, Georgetown, Qatar, and our campus from DC, bringing people together in a region to talk, to have conversations about issues as important as water and sustaining the Oasis. So we're not just doing this in DC, across schools, across disciplines. We're doing it across campuses, and this is powerful. And you should know that in the Earth Commons, we're hoping to do this not just by building environmental strengths with our partners here in Qatar. We're doing this in Greece. We're hoping to do this in Africa. We're hoping to do this in the New World by creating this new model of what we think is education. And it needs to be education for the future. So I'm an optimistic person. I focus on being hopeful. I don't like to think that doom and gloom motivate change. Of course, we may learn that there's a Gladwellian answer to that perhaps that doom and gloom does influence change more than hope. But I choose to focus on hope. I think that the dialogues that we can develop over the next 2 days, what we're doing here together, can really, really be powerful. We come together and cooperative as a team, talk about issues about something like water, which is essentially going to be the next fossil, or is becoming the next fossil fuel, as significant as the next fossil fuel in the next few years. So these are urgent issues of our time, and I'm beyond grateful for all of you coming together to share your expertise and perspectives on a variety of panels, focusing on everything from governance to how these issues influence biodiversity, something near and dear to my heart. By the way, my friend's mother moved back into her house, and she's fine, and the fire danger is now gone. So I'd like to introduce my esteemed colleague and counterpart, Dean Safwan Masri from Georgetown University, Qatar, to also offer you a welcome and introduce this morning's speaker. Thanks.
Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our esteemed guests, panelists, members of the Georgetown University community, friends, colleagues. Thank you for coming this morning. I want to start by, first of all, acknowledging my good friend and colleague, Pete Marra, for all the work that he's done in making today and tomorrow possible. Raha, for all the great work that she's done, Dr. Jamie Olson from Georgetown University in Qatar, Mark Giordano, who, among other things, brought us Raha. So thank you to all of you. So on behalf of Georgetown University in Qatar and Earth Commons, we welcome you to Sustaining the Oasis, Envisioning the Future of Water Security in the Gulf. This is the fourth in the series of signature Georgetown University in Qatar conferences under a common banner of Hiwaraat, which means dialogues. Hiwaraat's goal is to bring together scholars and practitioners, fostering collaboration and dialogue to effectively connect theory with real-world application. We inaugurated the series with the invasion of Iraq, regional reflections, followed by global histories and practices of Islamophobia. And over the past 2 days, in this very room, we hosted a conference on Afghanistan and confronting the impasse. In early December, we will close this season with Global Energy Cultures, How Energy Shapes Our Everyday Lives. All the topics are timely and critical, but this one is unique. This is the most ambitious conference to date that brings together Georgetown University in DC and Georgetown University in Qatar. It's deeply collaborative, and we're thrilled and inspired to be working with Dean Marra and his colleagues at Earth Commons. This conference also reflects GUQ's, Georgetown University in Qatar's, drive to build with partners an accessible and inclusive space for regional dialogue on the environment, blending our deep-rooted expertise in policy and international affairs with environmental science and education. Over the next 2 days, experts, policymakers, researchers, innovators, and stakeholders from across the region and globally will share their insights about the most vital resource on the planet, water. Every person in this room knows, at a fundamental level, that water sustains life. But if I may presume to speak for all of us, most of us take it for granted. There's water on the tables before you, flowing through pipes in this hotel, readily available in our homes. We're fortunate that it is simply always there. We just turn on the spigot. Sadly, we often have to be reminded of how perilous life is for those who are denied access to it. The World Health Organization reports that 1 in 3 people globally do not have access to safe drinking water. Oxfam reports that in Gaza right now, less than 4% of fresh water is drinkable. The surrounding Mediterranean Sea is polluted by sewage. Death from dehydration is a grave concern, especially for children and infants. Water security can never be taken for granted. The Gulf region's delicate desert and marine ecosystems are assaulted by climate change, putting both human and non-human populations at risk. Over the next 2 days, this conference will examine the historical significance of water and stewardship in the region while exploring a comprehensive future vision for water security. Now, when it comes to the exploration of important, relevant, and timely questions, I can think of no better exemplar of this sensibility than this morning's keynote speaker, whom it is my pleasure to introduce. Malcolm Gladwell has been a force in American culture and journalism for a quarter century. He's the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers: The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, What the Dog Saw, David and Goliath, and Talking to Strangers. He has been named one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine and one of foreign policy's top global thinkers. Malcolm Gladwell popularized the term tipping point in his best-selling book of the same name. The phrase denotes the moment that a certain idea, behavior, or practice catches on exponentially and gains widespread currency throughout a culture. This concept is increasingly relevant as we choose the path that our societies take to address the climate, water, and biodiversity crises. And not only will he be speaking to you all this morning, later today, at 1 p.m. at Georgetown University in Qatar. He and I will be in conversation, and we'll be talking about topics that he won't be covering in this keynote this morning. Everything from his creative process to meritocracy to his next book, a long-awaited sequel to The Tipping Point. So, without further delay, please help me welcome to the stage Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be asked to speak to all of you today. I thought I would stand here. It seems less formal. I've never been to this country before, so it's a real pleasure to be asked. And I'm also honored to be asked to speak on such an important topic. Although I should warn you, I'm not actually going to speak specifically about water security. I have a rule that says I never talk about things that my audience knows more about than I do. I came upon this rule the hard way. There's a graduate school in Manhattan called Rockefeller University, which is one of the most prestigious science grad schools in the world. Everybody, basically the entire faculty, has won a Nobel Prize at some point. And they used to have this public lecture series, which was basically they would bring in lambs for the slaughter. And I was once a lamb, and I came in and I gave this talk, and very foolishly I mentioned some missile system from the 70s. And at the end of my talk, this little old wizened white-haired guy in the front row raised his hand and said, still had the German accent. They often have German accents at Rockefeller. And he said, Mr. Gladwell, with respect to your discussion of the SS-70 missile, you are 100% incorrect. How do I know this? I designed the missile. So you never really recover from an experience like that. So I'm not going to speak directly to the subject of this conference, but I thought it would be appropriate as the first keynote of the conference, to talk more generally conceptually about the kind of challenge that you're facing and what that kind of challenge requires of you. What is the necessary mindset to successfully address a problem such as this? And to kind of get at that question, which I think is crucially important as you start to think about what it means to formulate a strategy. I thought the best way to do that was to tell you a couple of stories of innovators who have faced a similar kind of challenge, and to talk in particular about something that I think is crucial in this kind of problem solving, and that is what I like to call social risk taking. So I thought I would tell you the story of a very remarkable man who I actually consider to be one of the most remarkable innovators of the 20th century. He's someone actually I had the privilege of meeting on more than one occasion. It's a guy named Emil Freireich. Emil Freireich was a doctor, and he grew up very poor in Chicago, and he was drafted into the army in the 1950s. And back then, you had the option, if you wanted to serve, if you were a doctor, to do your military service at the National Institutes of Health, the major government-funded medical research operation just outside of Washington, D.C. And so Freireich shows up, and he goes to meet with a man named Gordon Zubrod, who was, at that point, the head of the National Cancer Institute, the foremost cancer researcher of his generation. And Zubrod says, "What do you do?" And Freireich said, "I'm a hematologist." He studies the blood, diseases of the blood. And Zubrod said to him, "Good, I would like you to tackle the problem of childhood leukemia." Now, most of us would be too young to remember that in the 1950s, and for the many centuries before that, childhood leukemia was the most feared of all childhood diseases. It was a disease without cure. It would, an otherwise healthy child as young as 6 months would come down with what looks like a cold, that would progress to what looked like a flu, they would spike an incredible fever, they would start to hemorrhage from every orifice in their body, and they would be dead without exception in 2 to 3 weeks. It was a truly terrifying disease. Every major hospital would have a childhood leukemia ward, and the walls and the floors would be covered with blood because the children were hemorrhaging, and the nurses would come out and their white outfits would be red. And the doctors would wouldn't even go in because it was too depressing. There was nothing they could do against this particular disease. And there were 4 drugs at the time which people would sometimes use against this, would try against this particular disease, and they were called 6-MP, methotrexate, vincristine, and the steroid prednisone. But all of them would have the same effect. You would give them to a child, the disease would go into remission for a week or 2 weeks, and then it would come roaring back when the cancer cells got resistant to that particular medicine. The children, meanwhile, would go through terrible side effects. And the side effects, in fact, were so terrible that doctors, generally speaking, didn't even bother to give children these drugs at all. They just said, what's the point? I'm just prolonging the child's agony. So this is the problem that Freireich has been given in the early 1950s. And he sits down and he thinks about it, and he has 2 extraordinary insights. His first insight was he looked at those 4 drugs and he said, individually, none of them seem to work against this disease, but what if I combine them? Now, today this is commonplace that we use more than one drug against cancer. In the 1950s, this was heresy. People thought that if you combine drugs, then somehow they would cancel each other out or they would cause extraordinary toxicities. But Freireich's observation was, look, if you look at the mechanisms of those 4 drugs, each of them are attacking this disease in a different way. This is the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and the Marines, that individually one of those branches can't defeat the enemy, but in combination they can. What if the same was true of cancer? Then, now the obvious rejoinder to that is, well, these are highly toxic drugs. They're poisons. They're chemotherapeutic agents. If you give a child 4 toxic drugs in combination, the side effects will kill them, right? Then Freireich had his second great insight, which was, yes, they're highly toxic, but they're all toxic in different ways, right? One of them causes your fever to spike. One of them causes, wipes out your immune system. One causes terrible neuropathy. They're not overlapping. They're doing different bad things to you. And maybe if I'm really aggressive in the way that I treat children for these side effects, I can keep them alive long enough for the drugs to work. So he starts this famous experiment. Starts with a 12-year-old girl, gives her these 4 drugs in combination. She goes through terrible side effects. And not only that, he misjudges the dose in the first case, and the girl nearly dies on the first night. And he spends the entire time by her bedside, and miraculously she pulls through. Her cancer goes in remission, and he tries it again on another patient, and another patient, another patient, and each one of those patients pulls through. And in 1965, he publishes one of the most famous studies in the history of modern cancer research that basically presents for the first time a successful case of combination chemotherapy, which remains the gold standard to this day of how we treat cancer. For his work, Freireich deserved but never got the Nobel Prize. It was in one of the most extraordinary medical findings of the 20th century. Now, think about that story for a moment as a model of innovation. Here we have someone who has 2 extraordinary insights, 2 ideas that had not occurred to anyone else. He executes these ideas under conditions of uncertainty. He takes an operational risk and observes the outcome, right? That is a classic entrepreneurial innovator's sequence, right? That you start with these ideas, you try them out, you take an operational risk, you take an empirical finding of the results, and you go forward from there. I think that when we think about innovation, we spend a lot of time thinking about that part of the equation. What is our idea? How are we going to execute it? How will we measure our success or failure, right? That's what we focus. When we think of innovators, we think of people who are particularly good at carrying out that kind of operation. But there's another side to this that I think is too often neglected, and that's social risk-taking. And the social risk-taking is, what is the environmental context in which you are executing your idea? What do people around you think of it? What kind of social obstacles are there to you doing your research or carrying out your work? And I think that the social risk-taking that's involved in bringing an innovation to fruition can often be as or more important than the operational risk-taking, particularly when we are dealing with an extraordinarily difficult and time-sensitive problem, right? So what I wanted to do this morning is to dwell on this subject of social risk-taking, which I think is of enormous relevance to this question that all of you are here to discuss. And there's two elements that I want to focus on in the social risk-taking paradigm. One is urgency, and the other one is disagreeableness. So Hiwaraat goes to Gordon Zubrod in the early 1960s with this idea that he's hatched, to use these 4 drugs in combination. And he says to Zubrod, look, I know these drugs have been used singly for years and years. I want to combine them. And Zubrod looks at him and says, are you crazy, right? And he says, no, I'm serious. And Zubrod says, well, do you have any animal data on whether this idea has any kind of, is there any empirical support for the notion that giving 4 drugs in combination will work? And Hiwaraat says, I don't have any animal data because we don't have an animal model, right? You can only proceed with any kind of preliminary animal research in cancer if you have a model, a mouse or something, that actually has a disease that you're interested in studying. In the early 1960s, there was no mouse model for childhood leukemia. And Hiwaraat says, I don't have a mouse model. I could develop one, but it would take years. So that's off the table. This is just really an idea that I've worked out in my head. And Zubrod says, okay, what about the side effects, right? They're going to be incredible. You're going to kill the children before you even cure them. And Hiwaraat says, actually, no. I've looked closely at the side effects. I think they're very different. My idea is that I can probably keep the children alive long enough for the drugs to work. At this point, Zubrod is just rolling his eyes. And he says, and what if you can't keep them alive? And what he means is, this is a government-funded research institute just outside of, a few miles from Congress. And a young man is proposing to take desperately ill small children and treat them with highly toxic chemotherapeutic agents that have never been used before, even on animals, right? He's like, if you fail, you will be pulled before Congress. They'll call you a Nazi doctor. They'll shut down the National Cancer Institute. The stakes here are extraordinary. He says, and what are you going to say to the parents? You're going to go to a parent whose child is bleeding from every, orifice of their body and in extraordinary pain, and you're going to say, well, I think what I want to do is take your child away and try out some crazy new drug regimen on them. Zubrod lists all of these objections, logical objections. And Hiwaraat, who is this enormous man, he was 6'6", looked like a bouncer, says to Zubrod, I don't care. Look, I have a ward of children at the clinical center at NCI. I got 20 kids with leukemia in there now. Every single one of them will be dead in 3 weeks. Why don't you let me try, right? And Zubrod says, okay. Now, what's crucial about that is that no one had thought about that problem before in that particular way. There were all kinds of people who were working on childhood leukemia around the world, but they were approaching it like an ordinary problem. An ordinary problem is a problem where we proceed carefully and methodically, where we line up all of the necessary partners to support us, where we dot our I's and cross our T's, where we take painstaking steps to ensure that every idea we have is backed by the appropriate evidence, right? We proceed in this orderly manner towards some kind of conclusion. But Freirich thought that this wasn't an ordinary problem, that you couldn't approach it in that way when you had a room full of children who would all be dead in 3 months, right? And because he sees the problem with that sense of urgency, it dramatically changes the way he approaches the challenge. Let me give you another example of this, because it's fascinating to see how many times entrepreneurs in these, innovators in these particular situations have this particular trait of urgency. This is a story from roughly the same era. In the late 1960s, Xerox, which was then the world's preeminent high-tech firm, built this legendary research center in the hills overlooking Stanford University in Silicon Valley. And it's called Xerox PARC. And it was the most extraordinary computer research institute ever built. It was this gorgeous modernist building, and they went out and they hired 60 or 70 of the most brilliant computer scientists from around the world, and they gave them unlimited research budgets, and they, all the help they wanted, incredible labs. And the guys from Xerox came in and just said, we're writing you a blank check. You're going to be on your own. Xerox is based on the other side of the country. We're as far away from you as possible. You're on your own. Your only instruction is go and invent the future of the office, right? And so over the course of the next 10 years, starting in the late 1960s, that's exactly what the people at Xerox PARC did. Everything we associate, virtually everything we associate with the personal computer revolution came out of Xerox PARC. They invented the first personal computer called the Alto. They invented Windows, they invented the mouse, they invented the Ethernet, they invented the laser printer, they invented the first word processing software. I could go on. It all came from Xerox PARC, from this group of geniuses. It's one of the most extraordinary innovative moments of the 20th century. So in fall of 1969, a guy named Steve, who worked down the street in Cupertino, had a little computer company named after a fruit, was told by his engineers that he should really go and check out what was going on at Xerox PARC. And at the time, this little company named after a fruit, you may have heard of it, it's called Apple, was just doing little, very, very basic computers that worked the old way. The old way computers worked, if you remember back that far, was that if you wanted the computer to do something, you had to type in a command on the command line, and then, right? So Steve goes to Xerox PARC, and they give him the tour, and they show him all these gadgets, the laser printer, the way that Windows worked. And finally they bring him to the Alto, and they said, we've invented this thing called the graphical user interface, which is you have a little thing you hold in your hand called a mouse, and when you want the computer to do something, you just click on an icon on the screen. You no longer have to type in long, complicated commands on your keyboard. It's as easy as a click. Anyone can use a computer now. And Steve Jobs, listens to this. He's 23 years old. And he says, this is the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard. This is what we needed to start the computer revolution. This is going to democratize this most crucial of innovations. And the people from Xerox said, yeah. And Jobs said, this is the future of computer. Yeah, and we know that. We invented the future. He's jumping up and down with excitement, and he races back to his little garage in Cupertino, and he turns to all of his engineers who are working on a computer called the Lisa, which is a traditional command line. And he says to them, stop. Not interested in that anymore. I just saw this incredible thing, something called a mouse and an icon on the screen. You click on that and boom, the computer does what you want. This is the future of computing. And they say, no, Steve, we're working on this other thing. We have all this money. He said, no. Drop everything and give me this graphical user interface. And sure enough, they do. And that computer is called the Macintosh. It's the computer that puts Apple on the map. It's probably the most significant product in the history of Silicon Valley. It launches Apple on this trajectory that's still on to this day, right? It's a computer where that's distinguished by the fact you have a little mouse and you click on the screen and it's called, and you click on a little icon and it does what you want to do, right? Okay, so what's the difference between Steve Jobs and the geniuses at Xerox PARC? Why is it that his idea works and we all use Apple products today and no one has a Xerox personal computer, right? Was he smarter than they were? No, they were smarter than he was. They invented all that stuff. He didn't. He just stole it. He didn't. Were they more insightful about the future than he was? No. When he said, do you guys realize this is the future of computing? They said, yes, we do. That's why we invented it. Did he have more resources than they did? No. He was a little guy in a startup in a garage. They were the amply funded research arm of the single most prestigious and profitable tech company in the world in the 1970s. So what's the difference between Steve Jobs and the guys at Xerox? He's in a hurry. That's it. He had a sense of urgency about this. He was like, not only do we have to do this, we have to do it now. And the guys at Xerox PARC, the geniuses there, they were like, well, we could still tweak some things. Let's work on this a little bit more. Let's build in some more features. And they were still tweaking things when he was selling the Macintosh to people around the world and establishing Apple as the paradigm of the new computer revolution, right? That quality of urgency is something that I think we underestimate when we look at the success of entrepreneurs, particularly when we're no longer dealing with ordinary problems. For Steve Jobs, the dawn of the computer age was not an ordinary problem, right? And that meant that he had to be willing to take a social risk. And believe me, there was a social risk involved in approaching that problem with such urgency. He had to go to his investors and his engineers and his board and everyone and say, we're on the wrong track. Stop. We're reversing course and building an entirely new product. Right? Because he was willing to take that social risk and put his urgency into action, he was able to seize the moment. So, back to Freireich. Freireich goes back to the hospital after he gets approval from Zubrod and starts his research. And everybody at the National Cancer Institute thinks he's crazy. And you can imagine why they do. They had been living with childhood leukemia for years. They considered it to be an unsolvable problem. And here's this kid, Freireich was only in his, I think, late 20s at the time. This big, towering kid comes in with this heretical notion of combining 4 drugs in combination and giving them to desperately ill 6-month-old children, right? They thought he was a monster. They honestly thought he was a kind of Nazi doctor. Freireich used to talk to all these people who were at NCI back then. Freireich he would give presentations at scientific meetings, and people would heckle him. If you could imagine, he's presenting data on how he is trying to solve one of the most dreaded of modern childhood diseases, and people would try and shout him down at scientific meetings. He used to, in order to keep his children alive, he had to give whole blood transfusions of the children he was treating. And back then, there wasn't the kind of blood products we have now. So you had to literally replace the blood of a child with other blood. So you had what's called a sausage, huge plastic balloon filled with blood, and you would transfuse the child. You would hold it like this. And if you make a mistake with this, what's called with the sausage, the child dies. They have stroke or. And once someone at NCI spotted Hiwaraat doing this incredibly dangerous procedure with a child like this big, and said, "If I see you do that again, you're fired." And Hiwaraat said, "Fine, because if I can't do this, I don't want to be here." Right? That's the kind of man that he is. People wouldn't work with him. He was at one point left really by himself to do this research because people thought people who were warned that their careers would be at stake, their reputations would be ruined if they were in any way associated with him when he was doing this research. But he didn't care, right? Why didn't he care? Because he was possessed of the quality of disagreeableness. Now, when I say that word, I don't mean obnoxious. That's the most obvious synonym for disagreeable. Disagreeable is the word that psychologists use to describe the characteristic of someone who does not require the approval of their peers to pursue a course of action, right? And when we are dealing with ordinary problems, that's not necessarily a good trait to have, right? An ordinary problem requires building consensus and bridges and bringing people together. When we are dealing with problems that are not ordinary, disagreeableness becomes a great advantage. Another illustration, a wonderful illustration of this is the story of the guy who founded IKEA, Ingevar Kamprad, who when psychologists talk about entrepreneurs, they talk about 3 traits. They are people who are open, highly creative, people who are conscientious, who are able to get something done, and people who are disagreeable, who do not require the approval of others to do what they want to do. And if you think about those 3 traits in combination, you realize that's why really great innovators are so rare, right? Lots of us can think of people who are creative, but who are not conscientious, right? That would be people sitting around in coffee shops in downtown Manhattan all day. Lots of people can think of us, we can all think of people who are conscientious but not creative, right? That's your accountant. You do not want your accountant to be creative. You want them to be. Those 2 traits in combination they're rare. And then you add the third, that you want someone to be disagreeable, not to be caught up in what others are thinking about them. And you understand, that's why there are so few people who are capable of bringing some kind of groundbreaking idea to fruition. So Kamprad is a good example of this. Kamprad is, he's Swedish, and he's running a furniture business in Sweden. And he has this really interesting idea, which is he realizes that a lot of the cost of a piece of furniture is bound up in its assembly. When you put the pieces together in the factory, it costs a lot of money. And then it also costs a lot of money to ship an assembled piece of furniture. And his great insight is, I'm not going to assemble it. I'm going to ship it flat and let the customer assemble it, right? And that's where IKEA is born. And he starts this business, and he runs into all this trouble with the furniture industry in Sweden. And people are basically boycotting him. Nobody will make his furniture, and he's facing bankruptcy. And then he has this idea, a second great idea, which is, wait a minute. Right across the Baltic Sea is Poland. Poland has a long tradition of making furniture. They've got lots of wood, and it's super cheap. This is 1961. Super cheap to build stuff there. I'm just going to move my operations to Poland. And IKEA, in its beginning, is basically flat furniture made in Poland. That's the business. That's the elevator pitch for IKEA. Right? Now, think about that. He's open, totally open. He's someone who has these 2 brilliant ideas that no one's had before. Shipping furniture flat and outsourcing it, like building it, making it somewhere else. He's conscientious. It's really hard to build a world-class manufacturing facility in Poland in 1961, right? He's able to do that incredibly, right? But what is he really? Disagreeable, right? Why? Do you know, this is 1961, the height of the Cold War. Tensions between the West and the East had never been higher. And here was a man from Sweden, from the Western Age, who was going over to the enemy side to build a factory and to and to make money, basically, and bring his products back to the West. People thought he was a traitor. People denounced him. People turned their backs on him. But Kamprad is able to go ahead with what he wants because he's disagreeable. He's not someone who requires the approval of others to do what he thinks is right? That, I think, is a crucially underestimated explanation for his extraordinary success. When people tell the story of IKEA, they focus so much on his original notion, the brilliance of this insight that you can just ship furniture flat and it'll, and that's a revolutionary way to build a cheap bit of furniture for a customer, that they forget that there was so much more to it than that he had to be someone who was also capable of staring down his critics and shrugging. Right? We're not hardwired to do that as human beings. I remember once doing research on somebody who was looking at marriages and trying to come up with predictors of why marriages fail. And the number one predictor of a failed marriage is when one party expresses contempt towards another. And why is contempt such a uniquely toxic emotion? Because it is the emotion of exclusion, right? Anger, if I'm angry with you, I care enough about you to disagree with you. Anger, implicit in anger is that we're still a unit, right? That's why I'm trying to change your mind. Contempt is where I've given up. No relationship can survive contempt because as human beings, we desperately need that kind of approval from those around us to give us some confidence and sense of worth in what we're doing. Kamprad doesn't need that. He doesn't care. It's like, no, I want to make furniture, right? And if people don't like what I'm doing in Sweden, that's totally fine. If you are somebody who is engaged in an ordinary problem, you don't need to be disagreeable. And one of the mistakes we make is to treat every one of the problems we face as an ordinary problem and to assume that it's not necessary to be urgent or to be disagreeable. I mean, the other scientists back in the 1960s working on child leukemia thought of it as an ordinary problem. It wasn't necessary to be in a hurry or to turn their backs on what their peers were thinking. The competitors to Ingvar Kamprad thought about making furniture. What could be more ordinary than making furniture? Right? Never occurred to them to do something that would challenge the status quo. The people at Xerox PARC thought of making this extraordinarily revolutionary thing called a personal computer as an ordinary problem. Right? They were going to do it their way, in a way that made them all happy, at their own pace. Never occurred to them that it fell into that other category of a problem that required some degree of social risk-taking. Well, I say all of this to all of you because you are engaged in a problem that is not ordinary, right? That requires some degree of social risk-taking. I was, reading about an editorial that was written not long ago about deforestation in the Amazon, making the point that there is a tipping point in Amazon deforestation. There's a point which we are perilously close to, where the ecosystem of the Amazon will change very quickly from our rainforest to a kind of savanna, right? Which with devastating consequences for the planet. If you look at the problem without that understanding, and you say, well, right now, 20% of the Amazon is deforested. That suggests that 80% is still there. We've got some time. We can work through the normal channels and be methodical and take our time and build a consensus and come up with an empirically sound strategy for addressing this issue. That's thinking of it as a normal problem, right? But it's not a normal problem. It's something that is going to change overnight, and we can't approach it with that same mindset if we expect to have any kind of positive outcome. Fry had a guy who he worked with named Tom Fry, and Tom Fry was the only one who believed in what Fry was doing, and he was in many ways the opposite of Fry. Fry was this big, towering, fiery monster, And Tom Fry was this very elegant, quiet man. And they were a team for 30 years at NIH. And when I got fascinated by Emil Fark, I went to see Tom Fry, who was then in a nursing home. And I asked him why they did what they did, because when they were pursuing this idea to solve childhood leukemia, they were putting their careers and their reputation at risk. If they had failed at any point during the way, they would have been out of the profession. It would have been over for them. Right? I said, why? You had a family. At any point you could have left and gotten a high-paying job somewhere in the private sector. Why did you persist for 10 years in pursuing this incredibly crazy notion about how to treat childhood leukemia? And he said to me, something I'll never forget, he said, because we had no choice. Right? Which I think is a beautiful way to sum up the mindset of the innovator who is willing to take social risks in pursuit of a problem that is not ordinary. And I would submit to all of you that you also have no choice. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I could listen to you for hours on end, and I think I can speak for everybody in this room when I say this. Thank you, Malcolm. That was really, really thought-provoking, counterintuitive, and incredibly fascinating. And I think the challenge, Pete, Raha, Jamie, everyone here, is to keep that front and center as we think over the next couple of days about the application. I mean, one thing that I take from this is how incredibly important to underscore the sense of urgency, right? And I'm thinking also of innovation in a place like an academic institution. I'm looking at my colleagues and thinking about what we're trying to do, right? And thinking, are we being creative? Are we being conscientious? And are we being disagreeable, right? And are we taking the right kind of social risks and operational risks? So can we start? I'm going to ask Mr. Gladwell a couple of questions. So we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then I will entertain questions from the audience. I know there will be lots of questions from the audience, so please scan the QR code that's at your table to forward questions to me that I will then address Malcolm with. Can we expand on that a little bit and think about climate change more broadly? I mean, you talked a little bit about the Amazon and talk about sort of the tipping point there, and how do we apply this idea of urgency and make a connection between social movements, tipping points, and the climate crisis globally?
Well, I think, the thing about tipping points is how profoundly counterintuitive they are. So I really think that as a kind of, all human beings are endowed with certain kind of baseline intuitive notions about the way the world works. There's a whole field of psychology that looks at intuitive psychology. And one of the most pervasive intuitive notions we hold is the idea that there is some linear relationship between cause and effect, between inputs and outputs. That when you push this hard, you get this much of whatever you're pushing goes this much faster. So it's very hard for us to acknowledge that to understand that there may be situations where change does not proceed in a linear manner. And the minute you are confronted with a problem that isn't linear in orientation, your whole sense of your timeline is thrown off. I mean, that's why I brought up the Amazon deforestation thing is, you hear, it's 20% deforested. So you think, okay, I have I got a lot of time, right? We're still early stages. Whereas when you understand, oh, no, it's a nonlinear model, and at 40% deforestation, the whole thing collapses. And then you realize, actually, we don't have a lot of time at all. That's just really hard. I mean, I think a lot of what we think of as climate denial is not actually climate denial. It is people struggling with to adjust to this kind of a non-intuitive timeline, right? A lot of what looks like climate denial is, yes, there's a problem, but we surely, we can take our time with this, or surely there's no reason for us to panic. It's that kind of, that's what it really means. They haven't grasped the peculiar dynamics of these complex systems. And I think that, go ahead.
No,
I was just going to say that if you reinterpret denial as a misunderstanding of the underlying model, then it changes the way you try and change people's minds.
So it's perspective. It's turning something on its head, to use an old cliche. And the counterintuitive is always very appealing, because a herd mentality would cause you to think in terms of, well, this is how you look at it, and you look at everything linearly. But if you pause for a second and you say, am I really looking at the problem the way that I should be looking at it? And then it becomes counterintuitive. But in Blink, you talk about also, I think it was in Blink, I've read all your books, and sometimes some of the ideas, I can't remember where I picked this one or that one from, which actually is to your credit, because when you've been influenced by somebody's thinking and you can't pinpoint exactly where or when you picked that up, that's a testament to how you've internalized it. You talk about the power of intuition, right? And that oftentimes we rely so much on analysis, right? When we should really rely more on the fact that we know it.
Yeah. Although, in Blink, I mean, I'm interested in educated intuition.
Right.
And I am also terrified of intuition that is developed in the absence of, experience. And so this would be, what we're talking about with climate change would be an example of the wrong kind of intuitive notion. And a really interesting question that I think would be worth spending more time on is there something wrong with the way we are kind of educating people's intuitions about the climate? Are we showcasing the right kinds of stories? Are we, and I don't have a good answer to that, but I suspect it does strike me that the persistence of skepticism about some of these issues suggests there's something very wrong with the way we are framing the problem for not just for the public, but for also policymakers of one kind or another.
Especially.
And for example, this is a semi-random question, but I think that the fastest way to get someone's attention on many issues is to frame it in economic terms, and that when insurers start weighing in on climate issues, I feel it gets people's attention in a way that almost no other intervention does. The debate in the United States, for example, over hurricane risk in Florida, that debate's been going on for a long time. It has only gotten traction very recently when insurers said, you know what, we're not going to sell you home insurance anymore. All of a sudden, all kinds of people who are shrugging this off are kind of standing up and saying, notice. It's the same message that all kinds of other people were saying, but it's come from a different place for different reasons, with different immediate consequences. And that somehow broke through people's kind of intuitive notion that this was a gradually unfolding problem.
Right.
When So the note from your insurer saying your premium just tripled or we're canceling it altogether resonates in a way that, the climate activists' speech does not. And I wonder whether we need to spend more time thinking about the kind of context in which we are educating people about these sorts of risks.
You're talking about educating them, you're talking about shaking them up, right? I mean, sort of a shock factor that gets you to act.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I mean, one of the questions I have, not for Malcolm, but for my colleagues who are experts over here is part of the stagnation in solving climate problems the fact that we have been approaching it linearly. Just, the fact that you have COP26, COP27, COP28, is that an incremental sort of gradual. Let me ask you another question, please, and that is, very related to this. What happens when you watch something, you go through a form of self-deception is basically what you're saying, right? That it is gradual, right? Hurricane risks in Florida. You watch a long fuse burning, but you don't do anything to extinguish the spark until the dynamite explodes, right? Mm-hmm. So you mentioned one example. It hasn't exploded yet. The Earth hasn't. But you look at, there have been decades worth of climate warnings that have been ignored. Think about the long march to Trump. Think about what Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, said 8 days before October 7, right? The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades, right? Under what circumstances are people more likely to take preemptive action, to listen to early, or to have early warning systems in place? Mm-hmm. And related to that, what role does social media and the 24/7 always-on media ecosystem play into this, positively or negatively?
Well, one thing I wonder about is whether some of the fundamental premises of the persuasion strategy are wrong. So normally, if I'm trying to persuade you to do something about which you are skeptical, I mix in my warnings with a lot of encouragement, right? And there's way too little encouragement of people on this issue. So by encouragement, I mean if you give people too many dire warnings about what might happen, what is going to happen, there's a real danger they will simply give up, right? So I talked earlier about when we look at the kind of universe of people who are in denial, there's some portion of what looks like denial is actually a misunderstanding of the model. Another portion of what looks like denial is people who accept there is a crisis, but have given up hope that there could be any effective. And I suspect that if you were to look at the full universe of denial, probably only a very small portion of it is true denial. A lot of it is those other things that I'm talking about, is people who say, yeah, but you've given me absolutely no reason to believe that we can address this issue in the time frame you've given me. So I'm going to go and put my head in the sand. It's pointless, right? That's all. So a good analogy of this is when you looked at the universe of people who were unwilling to get vaccinated against COVID.
Right.
Only a very small fraction of those people were legitimately those who had who thought that the vaccine was ineffective or dangerous. It's like probably 15% were in the true skeptic position. The remaining 85% were all different versions of either I don't have time for this, I am alienated from the healthcare system, I don't believe I'm at risk, and we tended to lump all of it under one umbrella and assume that everyone had the hard position of being fundamentally at odds with the conclusions of science. But in fact, most people didn't have a hard position. most people actually what they needed was some degree of encouragement, nudge. It, needed to be brought into the. And I wonder whether the same is true of the question of engaging people with the climate issue. That maybe there's a lot of people who just need to be encouraged that something could be done, that we've made progress already, that, a good example of this was the work that was done years ago on the ozone layer.
Right.
Was a success.
Yeah.
An extraordinarily small amount of time was spent trumpeting and congratulating all of us on that success. Right? Most people, I think today are completely unaware of the fact that that was a problem that was successfully solved on a multinational basis. Right? Worked. The system worked in that case. I don't understand why we don't spend more time talking about past successes, because that's the kind of thing that makes people believe that this is something that's possible to address.
It establishes trust, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of mistrust. I mean, to take the vaccine example, yes, persuasion, you talked about encouragement, nudging people, but trusting. I mean, there was a lot of distrust of pharmaceutical companies, a lot of distrust of the virus itself and what was being said about it. And even after the fact, today, when people encounter sort of new conditions that they had not been exposed to before or cannot explain otherwise, you often hear, or maybe, tell me if you do, it's the vaccines. Which vaccine did that person take?
Yeah.
Could that be causing this cognitive issue that they're having or this heart problem that they're having? Somebody dies suddenly, sort of unexplained, and they say it's a heart attack, but his heart was fine. And
yeah. No,
how does trust play into this?
Yeah. There is. I mean, all of this is kind of under the general category of we do need to be a lot more thoughtful in terms of how we are communicating what we would like to do, why we're doing it, what its chances of success are. And we need to learn from, I think, if you look at the last 20 years, movement hasn't done a very good job of convincing the public of its. So maybe it's time to kind of think of some new strategies.
Let's take some questions from the audience. I see a few on my screen. I want to be selfish and just continue asking you questions and having conversation, but this is about engagement here. So one question says, your message about being disagreeable and taking social risks is so important. What's your advice for educators to create the next generation of risk takers?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think that you had asked a question earlier about social media. And the problem with, one way to think about the problem with social media is it amplifies some of the wrong instincts particularly in young people, that it traps them in very kind of dense social feedback loops. And if you want to talk about the importance of disagreeableness, what a disagreeable person is doing is they are detaching themselves from those tight social feedback loops. And I think it's very hard if you're checking your phone every 5 minutes to see how people are responding to your Instagram post. Really hard to be disagreeable. You can't, you're getting so worked up about what people are saying about you, and you've personalized your experience of the world in such a profound way that you don't have the kind of freedom to step out of that and pursue something unpopular. I do think that one of the things educators could do is to build the kind of emotional resilience that makes disagreeableness, help build the kind of makes disagreeableness possible. That's really what someone like Farag has is just an enormous amount of emotional resilience.
Right.
Just like, he's not a sociopath, not a sociopath. He's just someone who is comfortable with the idea that for the time being, my colleagues are not on board with what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Okay? Right?
Have the confidence.
He's like, and he understands, as he would have explained it, this is a temporary thing.
Right.
And if I fail, it's a noble failure. I mean, I don't think he kind of catastrophized his position because he's someone who had some element, sort of baseline of self-confidence. And I think the same was true of Jobs or Kamprad or all those people I was talking about. The goal is trying to kind of build that resilience.
It's difficult with young people, isn't it? I mean, I think of people who are in our generation or at our age. You develop that confidence, if you will, or that willingness to fail, to take risks, because you've seen it, right? And you've seen that, okay, you stumble, you fall, you get up. A 20-year-old college student doesn't have that, right? So are they likely to be less resilient or less willing to take risks, less willing to fail? I mean, I'm with you. People should fail and fail well, right? Because otherwise they're not taking risks. They're not moving forward.
I mean, a lot of this as well is creating environments, sort of safe environments for risk-taking. To kind of link it to what we're talking about here, I really do believe there is far too little conscious experimentation in policymaking, where we start from the premise that we don't know the right way to attack this particular problem, and we are going to try several things simultaneously and assess them and go with the winner. And what you do when you have that kind of mindset is you instantly make everyone part of the learning process. As opposed to having a class of winners and losers, we're all complicit in trying to figure this out. One of us will be the lucky one, but the rest of us are contributing to the success of the operation by our willingness to try different ideas, or ultimately unsuccessful ideas. And that's a kind of a safe way to encourage this kind of risk-taking.
Right. One more question? One more question, Raha. Raha is looking at me. Okay. One more. So I'll give you a couple and then you choose which one you're going to answer. How do you distinguish what constitutes an ordinary problem versus an extraordinary problem? And another one is, how do you take the right kind of social risk when you have multilateral parties and their consensus is important? And the example that the questioner is using is such as in the case of the Conference of the Parties.
Yeah. Well, the first of those questions is a lot easier to answer than the second. Although I will, I know what I'll do. I'm going to answer the second in a very, very elliptical way. When I did my last book, The Bomber Mafia, I spent a lot of time with people in the Air Force, senior officers of the Air Force, and U.S. Air Force. And one of the things that really struck me was, first of all, the Air Force, U.S. Air Force, spends a lot of time sending its officers, particularly their young officers, to work with other countries' air forces. So virtually every senior officer you talk to spent, I did 3 years in Saudi Arabia working with the Saudis, or I did 2 years in Poland. And the second thing, and then you realize that they do that very deliberately because they want to create relationships. And those relationships are sustained as these people. So I was talking to some senior guy at the Air Force about some issue that had come up. And I said, are you worried about this? He goes, well, between you and me, I called my counterpart named this very big country. I chatted with him and I think we're going to be okay. And I realized that what we observe from the outside is in relationships among countries, is we see the layer of politicians and diplomats who are interacting. But the world, one of the things that makes the world safe is when there are multiple layers of interactions between, some of which we don't see, but it's a crucial way in which we build resilience and we build opportunity in international relationships, is by having multiple forms of interaction between skilled people. And I think that in answer to that question, the trick is to try and build even more of those kinds of subterranean networks. And subterranean networks are these kind of, I don't want to use the word clandestine, but they are kind of clandestine. We don't see them, but they're enormously effective at bringing about, you can get very motivated parties who are, below the level of politics and diplomacy, can bring about consensus and come up with ideas, and those ideas can trickle upwards in their home country. And that can be a surprisingly effective way of bringing about change. So I wonder whether if we're starting a campaign, one of the first things we should start to think is, how can we do a better job at building those kinds of subterranean connections?
Yeah, that's very powerful. And to resist, because what often happens in building consensus is that you end up adopting the least common denominator, right?
Yes.
Which is, what the meeting of Arab and Muslim leaders yesterday in Riyadh is, I think, rightly accused of having come up with, right? So you've had different ideas, but then you agree on what everybody can agree on. So I like that idea of the subterranean. Malcolm, thank you so much for giving of your time, of your wisdom, and thank you all for listening so intently. I know that everybody has enjoyed it tremendously. We're very fortunate to have you with us. We're very fortunate also that your first visit to Doha, I hope it is the first of many, but that you've graced us with that first visit. So thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming.